What if the key to longevity wasn't in your DNA, but in your daily routine? It was 6:45 a.m. in the quiet suburbs of Tucson, Arizona, when Frank Miller first stumbled across that video. It was buried beneath a pile of late-night YouTube recommendations, a thumbnail showing Elon Musk walking briskly into the Tesla Gigafactory wearing a black tee and jeans, looking, well, unusually fit for a 51-year-old tech billionaire juggling rockets and robots. Frank didn't think much of it at first. He clicked it because the title was catchy, The Unexpected Reason Elon Musk's Body is Better Than Yours, Even at 51. He chuckled, muttering, yeah, sure. What's next? Jeff Bezos doing CrossFit with ninjas? But 30 seconds in, something strange happened. He leaned forward. Elon, in his usual matter-of-fact tone, was talking about how he used to neglect his health. I used to eat terribly and never work out, he admitted, but now followed a disciplined routine. The clip cut between interviews, workout footage, and clips of Musk boxing, swimming, walking 5 miles a day, and practicing intermittent fasting. It wasn't just fluff. There were graphs, sleep trackers, and even a section about how optimizing his health improved his decision-making and stress control. And then came the quote that pierced straight through Frank's crusty, retired heart. You don't need a perfect body. You need energy. Because energy lets you fight when things get hard. Frank paused the video. His living room, dimly lit by the soft Arizona morning sun, fell silent. Coffee cooled in his untouched mug. That sentence echoed. Because deep down, he was exhausted. Not just physically, though the ache in his knees and back never really left anymore, but emotionally, mentally. The kind of tired that sleep didn't fix. The kind that crept up on you when purpose quietly slipped out the back door. His hand hovered over the mouse. Then, as if someone else took control, he moved the cursor down and clicked subscribe. The little bell icon lit up. Then he did something wildly uncharacteristic. He left a comment. 68 years old retired engineer here. Haven't felt energetic in a decade. Maybe it's time to try something different. He didn't expect anyone to reply. Who cared what some old man thought? But the response came faster than expected. You've got this, Frank. Start small. One walk. One meal. One mindset shift. Hit me up if you want to start a support group. I'm 62 and trying the same thing. At Sarah Rebuilds Life. The rest of the day felt different. Let's rewind a bit. Frank Miller had retired 6 years earlier, after a long career designing electronic systems for airplanes. He once worked on navigation modules for early Boeing jets, and at his peak, he could rewire a control panel blindfolded. But after the sudden loss of his wife, Claire, everything dimmed. He withdrew. Slowed down. He still went through the motions, morning coffee, midday nap, an occasional visit from his son Jason, but his soul had been stuck in neutral ever since. His house was clean but too quiet. His fridge full but mostly with frozen meals. He read books but couldn't remember the plots. Days passed without meaning. Until this morning. Something about that video, it wasn't just the content, it was the energy. Elon wasn't trying to be a fitness guru. He wasn't dancing around like a Peloton instructor. He was just, honest. Focused. Alive. Frank stood up from his armchair, joints popping like bubble wrap, and walked to the bathroom mirror. He stared at his reflection. Gray stubble. Pale skin. Eyes with bags so deep they looked like carry-ons. He didn't hate what he saw. But he didn't recognize it either. What happened to you? He asked his reflection. He didn't have an answer. But he had a question. And that was enough to start something. Later that evening, Frank called his son Jason. Hey, Dad, Jason answered, mid-shift at the clinic. Everything okay? Frank hesitated. You ever heard of intermittent fasting? Jason blinked. Yeah, it's been around. Why? I think I'm going to try it. Maybe mix in some light workouts too. Jason laughed. Since when do you care about fitness? I don't know. I guess, since today. There was silence on the line. Then a soft sigh. Okay, Jason said, cautious. As long as you go slow. And don't try to turn into some kind of wannabe tech bro. Frank chuckled. Too late. Already ordered black t-shirts. Jason laughed. God help us. That night, Frank lay in bed longer than usual, not because he was tired, but because his mind was awake, alive in a way it hadn't been in years. He thought about everything Elon said. Not about building rockets or tweeting memes, but about taking control of time. About using structure to regain chaos. About how a person didn't have to settle, no matter how old they were. He wrote a list on his notepad. Wake up before 7 a.m. Walk 30 minutes a day. Try intermittent fasting, 12 to 8 window. Track meals and sleep. Reach out to Sarah. Don't tell the neighbors yet, they'll think I'm nuts. He smiled to himself, tucked the notepad into his nightstand, and turned off the light. The hum of the ceiling fan was the only sound in the room. And for the first time in a long time, Frank didn't dread the morning. He was building something again, not a machine, not a rocket, but himself. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Miller was never the loudest guy in the room, but when he spoke, people listened. It wasn't just the deep, calm cadence of his voice or the fact that he had worked on systems that kept planes in the air, it was the certainty. The quiet confidence that came from knowing your wiring wouldn't short out at 30,000 feet. Now, at 68, Frank was long retired from his engineering days at Northrop Grumman. He spent over 3 decades inside labs, crawling under dashboards, and sketching out diagrams that only 5 people on Earth could probably understand. He designed interfaces for fighter jets, helped optimize signal flow for satellite tracking systems, and even contributed to a classified project he still couldn't talk about. That part of his life? It was electric, literally and figuratively. But that was before. Before Claire got sick. Before his son moved to Seattle. Before he began measuring days not in progress, but in pills. Frank's house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac lined with well-manicured cacti and neighbors who waved out of politeness more than interest. His morning routine had become ritualistic: wake up at 8 a.m., coffee, 2 sugars, no cream, toast, a scan through the paper, maybe a bit of morning news until it all blended into white noise. Sometimes he'd go out for a short walk around the block, but usually, he didn't bother. Arizona mornings were beautiful but unforgiving on aging knees. His neighbors, the Turners, had started calling him Ghost Grandpa. Not to his face, but he'd overheard their grandson once while taking out the trash. At first it stung, then it stuck. He even started jokingly calling himself that in emails to Jason. Jason. His only child. The bright spot. Jason had taken the intellectual torch Frank passed down, only instead of hardware, he dove headfirst into the human brain. Now a neurologist, Jason worked at a neuroscience center in Seattle, leading a team researching cognitive decline in aging patients. "You'd love it here, Dad," Jason had said last Christmas. "We're doing amazing work on neuroplasticity." Frank had laughed. "I'm still getting over how fast phones got rid of buttons." Their relationship was good. Strong, even. But it had cooled since Claire died 5 years ago. She'd been the warm glue between them, the one who understood Frank's silences and Jason's intensity. Without her, father and son seemed to orbit each other at a safe emotional distance. They checked in, but didn't check in. Frank still wore his wedding ring. His garage, however, told a different story. Where most retirees stored golf clubs or unused gym equipment, Frank's was a mini-lab. Circuit boards, soldering irons, a vintage oscilloscope, and shelves full of labeled boxes, switches, voltage, DC connectors, microchips, obsolete but sexy. He didn't build much anymore. The spark just wasn't there. But sometimes he'd go out, sit at his old workbench, and tinker, just enough to remember who he'd been. Next to his bench sat Claire's old garden cart. She used to grow tomatoes and basil out back before the chemo wiped her energy. Frank never had the heart to throw it out. Now, a succulent she'd planted years ago still clung to life in the corner of the backyard, barely, but stubbornly. Like him. Frank wasn't unhealthy, exactly. But he wasn't well either. His knees hurt. His back hurt. He was 20 pounds overweight and borderline pre-diabetic, according to his last checkup. His doctor had told him, "We're not at red alert yet, but the light's blinking yellow, Frank." He'd shrugged. "At least it's not blinking end." But lately, he'd started to feel it. The difference. How the days blurred together. How getting out of a chair was something he had to plan. He didn't want to be a burden. Didn't want Jason flying down just to watch him shuffle from chair to chair like a ghost in khakis. That's why that Elon Musk video shook him. Here was a guy, same generation, same stress level, but thriving. Moving. Creating. Hell, Musk wasn't just running companies, he was launching space missions and talking about colonizing Mars. Meanwhile, Frank struggled to colonize his own garage. It wasn't jealousy. It was inspiration. Frank didn't want to build a rocket. He just wanted to rebuild himself. That night, after watching the video, Frank took out a notebook. Not the iPad Jason gave him, he never really got the hang of it, just a real, spiral-bound notebook with graph paper inside. He opened to the first page. Project Reboot, inspired by Elon. He smiled. That's how he used to title system upgrade documents at work. Always with a dramatic name. It felt right. He wrote. Daily wake-up, 6:30 a.m. Morning walk, 30 minutes, start slow. Start intermittent fasting, 12 to 8 o'clock. Track calories on paper, forget the app. Research Musk's routine, legit sources only. Talk to Jason, get medical okay. Find online support, Reddit maybe. He stared at the list for a while, pen tapping the margin. Then he flipped the page. At the top, he wrote, who I want to be at 70. And beneath that, 3 words. Capable. Curious. Alive. Before bed, he searched for the Reddit thread someone had mentioned in the comments. He found it, r/Musk mode. Thousands of members. Many of them middle-aged. A few even in their 70s. All trying to optimize their lives, not in the tech bro sense, but in a real, human, I'm tired of drifting, kind of way. Frank created a username at LateBloomer68. He posted his story. Just a few sentences. The response was overwhelming. He had replies from New York, Norway, and New Zealand. Encouragement. Tips. A few skeptics, sure, but the signal was louder than the noise. And one reply stood out. At Sarah Rebuilds Life, welcome, Frank. I'm 62. Started my own Musk-inspired journey last year after my stroke. Walking every day. Fasting. Journaling. You're not too late. You're right on time. Frank stared at her message for a while, feeling something stir. Not excitement. Something deeper. And for the first time in years, he wasn't just waiting for life to happen to him. He was plotting a course. Frank had always thought of himself as a man of precision. He liked things neat, systems, processes, steps. Engineering had given him the perfect outlet for his obsession with order, the constant need to tweak and optimize. But as he sat there, holding his cup of coffee that morning, watching the sun climb over the desert horizon, he wondered if he'd applied that same precision to the most important project of all, his life. Growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, Frank was never the golden child, but he was steady. His parents were working-class folks, neither rich nor poor. His father, George, worked as an industrial welder, and his mother, Helen, kept the house in immaculate condition, though the cleaning never seemed to stop. Theirs was a quiet life, where routines were sacred. Frank had been taught that stability was the foundation of success. If you could manage the mundane, you could conquer anything. He spent his childhood taking things apart: radio clocks, old bicycles, remote controls. His parents never understood it. "You'll break it if you keep doing that," his mother would scold, but Frank was persistent. Eventually, the act of figuring out how something worked became a kind of therapy for him, a way to make sense of a world that was, to him, full of noise. At school, Frank wasn't particularly popular, but he was respected. He had a quiet intelligence. In high school, his passion for technology was sparked when he took his first electronics class. He loved the feel of the soldering iron in his hand, the way circuits would hum to life under his fingertips. He spent hours tinkering in his makeshift lab in the basement, creating devices that were part science, part art. But it wasn't until his senior year that things changed. He started dating Claire. She was everything he wasn't: loud, adventurous, outgoing. She had a smile that could light up an entire room and a laugh that made Frank feel as though he was in on a secret joke. They met at a local diner one Saturday night when Frank was doing his usual, sitting at the counter reading a book while everyone else socialized. "Why don't you ever talk to anyone?" she had asked, plopping down next to him. "Because I don't need to," Frank had replied, only half joking. "Well, that's boring," Claire said, grinning. From that moment, everything changed. Claire became his world. She had a way of drawing him out of himself, making him see things differently. She had big dreams of traveling, experiencing life in ways Frank had never considered. For her, the world wasn't something to be fixed or controlled, it was something to be lived. And somehow, in all of her wildness, Claire gave Frank a sense of peace. They went to college together, both attending the University of Michigan. Claire majored in psychology, while Frank pursued electrical engineering. He threw himself into his studies, but Claire. She was already looking beyond the classroom, eager to see what the world had to offer. After graduation, Frank got a job at Northrop Grumman, and Claire, after some back and forth, decided to follow her own dream of starting a counseling practice. They bought a small house in Virginia and began to build their lives together. Frank worked long hours, diving deep into his career, constantly traveling for work, designing systems that pushed the limits of technology. Claire, meanwhile, was building her practice from the ground up, helping families and children navigate trauma, addiction, and the complexities of life. For the first few years, it worked. They balanced their careers, their dreams, and their love. They were a team, though in retrospect, Frank could see how he had become more and more absorbed in his work. He didn't notice it at the time, but the distance between them was growing. Claire had wanted children, but Frank had always put it off, convincing her that they needed to focus on their careers first. "Let's wait until we're settled," he would say. "It'll be easier when things slow down." But things never slowed down. And slowly, Claire began to feel it. The isolation. The lack of family. The empty spaces in their home that she filled with plants and books, but never with the children they had once dreamed of. By the time Frank realized what he had missed, it was too late. Claire's desires had shifted, and her patience had worn thin. Their conversations became quieter, the silence in their house more pronounced. When Claire was diagnosed with breast cancer, the rift between them was impossible to ignore. Her battle was long and grueling, but during those years, Frank realized just how little he had truly seen her. He spent most of his time in his lab, avoiding the painful reality of her illness. It was easier to fix machines than face the reality of losing someone he loved. Then came the day he couldn't ignore it anymore. It was early autumn, and the air was crisp when Claire passed away. The grief was a cold wave that rolled over him, drowning him in its depths. For weeks, he felt as if he were moving through water, everything was muffled, distant, unreachable. When the funeral ended, Frank found himself alone, in a house that felt like a tomb. He tried to throw himself back into his work, but nothing felt right anymore. The circuits no longer buzzed with life. There was no joy in fixing things that couldn't feel. He began to withdraw. To shut down. Frank leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he put his cup down. His reflection in the window seemed distant, as if the past had already started fading into something less tangible. He thought about what he'd just written in his notebook, "Who I want to be at 70, and realized it wasn't just a question about his health. It was a question about his life. About everything he'd lost by getting stuck in the static of work, grief, and routine. He had forgotten the most important part of living, connection. Not just with others, but with himself. As Frank gazed out the window, he felt something stir. Not a sense of regret, but of possibility. Maybe this was his chance. To do things differently. To finally stop running from the things that scared him, his age, his health, his loneliness, and start building again. Not just circuits and wires, but a life worth living. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Frank woke up at 6 a.m. the next morning. It wasn't a triumphant moment, not some grand victory over sleep or his laziness. It was just, quiet. Still. The air in his bedroom felt different, fresher, somehow, as though the universe had been waiting for him to finally take a breath. He hadn't set an alarm. But he had set an intention. He stared at the ceiling, the usual grogginess hanging in the air, but something else was there too. A little spark. A hint of energy he hadn't felt in years. Frank swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet landing on the cool wood of the floor. For a moment, he didn't move. He didn't think. He just breathed. In, out, slow and deliberate. The same breath he had avoided taking for so long. He stood up. The walk was the hardest part. Not the actual walking, no, he could do that. But the step to get started. To break the inertia. It was easy to stay in the chair, easy to stay in bed, easy to stay in a life that felt like a constant loop of starting over and never really getting anywhere. But today was different. Frank pulled on his old sneakers, the ones with worn-out soles and frayed laces. He hadn't used them in months, but they still fit. Still felt like home. Claire had bought them for him on their 20th anniversary. She'd laughed and said, "You're not allowed to be a workaholic in those shoes." She had been right. The early morning air outside was chilly but refreshing. The kind of crisp that made you feel alive. Frank had always loved mornings. There was something special about that sliver of time before the rest of the world woke up, quiet, still, untouched. It was in those moments that Frank felt closest to himself. He walked down the sidewalk slowly at first, feeling the tightness in his knees and back. It had been a while since he'd moved this much. Each step was an effort, but not a painful one, more like a reminder that his body had once known how to move, how to stretch. He wasn't sure how long he'd walk, but he'd take it one step at a time. 30 minutes. That was his goal. When Frank returned to the house, he was winded, but not exhausted. His legs ached a little, and his heart was beating a bit faster than usual, but that was the point. He hadn't realized how stagnant he'd become, how little he had pushed himself physically. It wasn't just his body that had been stuck in a loop, it was his mind, his soul. He grabbed the bottle of water he had left on the kitchen counter and drank deeply. The sun had fully risen now, and the house felt warmer somehow. The silence wasn't as suffocating. For the first time in a while, Frank felt a small wave of accomplishment. I did it. I made the first step. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 7:30 a.m. That gave him plenty of time before his daily routine. But today, things would be different. There was a shift, subtle but undeniable. He wasn't just checking off items on a to-do list anymore. This was a conscious decision to change. Frank sat at his kitchen table with his notebook open in front of him. His breakfast was simple, scrambled eggs with a side of avocado, just like the intermittent fasting forums recommended. He hadn't had this much energy for breakfast in years. Today was the day he would write something new. He flipped open his phone and opened the r/Musk mode subreddit. The support he had found there in the past day felt like a lifeline, something he hadn't realized he was missing. People shared their stories, some of struggle, some of triumph, and it was as if Frank had found his tribe. He typed out a post. Day 1, starting my Musk-inspired journey. I've been stuck in neutral for too long. Starting with small changes today, walking, fasting, no more excuses. I'm ready. He hesitated before hitting send, but then did it anyway. The response was almost instant. At Sarori Builds Life, you've got this, Frank. It's not about perfection, it's about persistence. One day at a time. At Engineer Steve, I'm 58. I started this same journey 6 months ago. Lost 30 pounds and feel better than I did in my 40s. You're in the right place. Frank smiled. He wasn't alone. He wasn't the only one who felt like he was starting over from scratch. The rest of the morning passed by quietly. Frank had a phone call with his doctor, Dr. Parker, just to touch base and let him know about the changes he was starting to make. Dr. Parker had been supportive, though skeptical. Just don't overdo it, Frank. You're not 30 anymore. But taking care of yourself now, even in small ways, will make a huge difference. Frank had agreed. Small ways. That's all he could handle for now. But for the first time, it felt like the weight of the past was starting to lift. Later that afternoon, Frank set aside his usual routine. No emails. No tinkering with circuits. He took another step, he called Jason. The phone rang for a few seconds before Jason answered, his voice familiar, but distant. Hey, Dad, Jason said. Everything okay? Frank hesitated for a moment, unsure how to begin. He wasn't exactly sure how to explain the shift inside him. How to say, I'm trying again. But in the end, he simply said, I'm starting to change, Jason. I'm doing something about it. I'm taking care of myself. For real this time. There was a pause. Then Jason responded, Dad, that's great. I'm proud of you. Really. Frank felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure why it felt so hard to say. He had always been the one to fix things, to have the answers. But today, he wasn't trying to fix anything. He was just trying to live. That evening, Frank sat in his living room with a cup of herbal tea, staring out at the desert landscape. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the sun setting on another day of small victories. He felt tired. Good tired. The kind of tired that comes from knowing you've taken the first step in a journey you didn't think you could begin. But Frank knew one thing for sure now, this was only the beginning. Tomorrow, he'd do it all again. And maybe, just maybe, it would be easier. The first few days were easy. The excitement of starting something new, the novelty of change, it all kept Frank going. But soon, the initial surge of motivation began to fade, and the reality of his decisions started to set in. He had woken up at 6 a.m. for the past 5 days, lacing up his old sneakers and taking that quiet walk around the neighborhood. He'd stuck to his intermittent fasting schedule. He had even started lifting weights again, small dumbbells at first, just to see if his body could still remember how to move. It was all supposed to be simple. A series of small adjustments, building on one another, leading to a healthier, happier Frank. But by day 6, Frank had hit his first real roadblock. It started with his knees. The dull ache he had noticed on his morning walks began to intensify. It wasn't sharp, but it was persistent, like a nagging reminder that he wasn't as young as he once was. At first, he brushed it off, telling himself it was just part of the process, muscle soreness, maybe a bit of tightness from all the sitting he'd done over the years. But by the time he went for his walk on the 6th morning, it had become unbearable. He paused halfway through the walk, feeling the discomfort tighten with each step. Frank looked around, breathing heavily, his mind a swirl of frustration. He had barely been at this for a week, and already, he was facing a setback. He didn't want to stop, but his body was sending him a clear signal. This isn't going to be easy. The next few days felt like an internal battle. Frank pushed through his physical discomfort, forcing himself to continue with his walks. He ignored the warnings his body was giving him, because he couldn't bear the thought of failing this early. But it wasn't just his knees that were giving him trouble. There was something else gnawing at him, a deeper unease, one he couldn't quite place. The weightlifting was another hurdle. He had always been strong, always enjoyed pushing himself in the gym. But now, the idea of lifting weights felt different. He was no longer the 30-something guy who could bench press his body weight without breaking a sweat. Each lift felt heavier, not just physically, but mentally. How could he ever get back to where he was? He tried to push through the discomfort, thinking it was just a temporary phase. But by the end of the week, Frank realized that his body wasn't just reacting to physical exertion, it was reacting to a deeper, more profound truth. The muscles he had once built with such pride had atrophied, and so had the habits that had kept him grounded. His identity had become so tied to his work that everything else had faded into the background. His body, his health, his relationships, they all had taken a back seat. And now, as he tried to make changes, his body was resisting. The consequences of years of neglect were showing up at the worst possible time. On day 8, Frank found himself sitting on the edge of the couch, staring at the empty space on the wall where Claire's painting used to hang. He hadn't thought about it in a while, too focused on his own transformation, but the absence of it hit him like a ton of bricks. The house, which had once been a place of shared life and love, now felt hollow. The memories he'd tucked away for so long were rising to the surface, making him question everything he was doing. He wanted to believe that the physical transformation was all that mattered, that if he just took care of his body, everything would fall into place. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Frank could feel the ache in his chest, the loneliness creeping in at the edges of his mind. It wasn't just about getting fit, it was about facing the life he had left behind. He dialed Jason's number. It rang a few times before his son picked up. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" Jason's voice was warm, but there was a slight hesitation, as if he could tell something was off. I don't know if I'm cut out for this, Jason," Frank said, his voice low. "I've been pushing through, but my body's giving up on me. My knees hurt, my strength isn't what it used to be. And I feel like I'm doing this all for nothing. I'm not sure if I can keep going." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Jason let out a quiet breath before responding. "Dad, I think you're making it harder on yourself than it needs to be. You're doing something good for yourself. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. You've been through a lot, and change takes time. If you're hurting, slow down. Listen to your body. It's okay to take a step back." Frank swallowed hard. His son's words hit him with a clarity he hadn't expected. It's okay to take a step back. He had been pushing himself so hard, so fast, trying to prove something. But in the process, he had ignored the one thing that had always kept him grounded: patience. "Thanks, Jason," Frank said quietly, his throat tight. "I needed to hear that." That night, Frank lay in bed, his knees throbbing slightly, but his mind quieter than it had been in days. He knew he couldn't keep pushing himself like this. He had to adjust, be kinder to himself. Progress wasn't linear. There would be setbacks, days where he would feel discouraged. But that didn't mean he had failed. It meant he was human. The next morning, he took a different approach. Instead of pushing through a walk, he focused on stretching, gentle stretches for his legs, his back. He walked a little slower. He did his strength training with lighter weights, focusing on form, and stretching afterward. It wasn't the intense workout he had originally imagined, but it was progress. The next few days felt less like struggle and more like an experiment. Frank was learning to listen to his body, to move at his own pace. It wasn't easy. He wanted instant results, the kind of progress that would show up on a scale or in the mirror. But he was learning that the changes that really mattered wouldn't be visible overnight. They were happening inside, in the way he thought about himself and his life. By the end of the second week, Frank had come to a realization: he wasn't just facing obstacles in his physical transformation. He was facing himself. The things he was avoiding, the emotions he had buried, the fears he had ignored, they were all coming to the surface, and they were part of the process. It was going to be tough. But it was also going to be worth it. It had been 3 weeks since Frank started his journey. 3 weeks of struggling, adapting, and facing a mixture of triumphs and failures. The mornings had become a routine, no longer filled with dread, but not yet fully embraced with enthusiasm. They were just part of the day now. His knees still ached occasionally, and his body was far from what he remembered, but something had shifted inside him. He was still in the game. The small victories were starting to add up. Frank woke up at 6 a.m., just like the past few weeks. He didn't need an alarm clock anymore, his body had started to wake up on its own, just before sunrise. It was a strange feeling, this new rhythm. For the first time in years, he was connected to his own body. He felt its needs, its limitations, and its small victories. This morning, the air felt warmer, the sunlight creeping through the windows like a gentle reminder of the fresh start that had begun. Frank stretched slowly, taking in the deep breath of the cool desert air. He got up from bed, feeling the stiffness in his legs, but it wasn't as bad as it had been. The ache was still there, but it wasn't the overwhelming kind he'd experienced in the first few days. He knew he had been adjusting, both physically and mentally, and today would be different. After his morning stretches, Frank stood in front of his bathroom mirror, examining his reflection. It wasn't much, just a little more definition in his arms, a slight tightness in his chest and abs, but most importantly, there was a difference in his eyes. They were clearer. Less clouded by the fog of regret or complacency. He could see it now. He was changing. He smiled, then pulled on his sneakers for another walk around the neighborhood. This had become his favorite part of the day. The quiet moments, the peace before the world fully woke up. It wasn't about speed anymore. It wasn't about pushing himself to the limit. It was about feeling his body move, working with it, not against it. He set a goal that morning: today, he would walk for 45 minutes instead of 30. He wasn't sure how it would feel, but he was going to try. The first 10 minutes were easy. The rhythm of his feet on the pavement felt comforting, almost meditative. He passed by his neighbor's house and waved at Mrs. Walters, who was always sitting on her porch with a cup of coffee. She waved back, smiling, as she always did. Frank wasn't sure when he'd last waved to her before this. The next 20 minutes were a little tougher. His knees were starting to feel it again, the familiar tightness that warned him to slow down. He pushed through, but instead of ignoring the pain like he used to, he slowed his pace and focused on his breathing. It wasn't about forcing himself to go harder. It was about listening to his body. By the time he reached his driveway, the pain had subsided, and he felt more alive than he had in a long time. That afternoon, Frank decided to take another step forward. He went back to the gym. It had been months since he'd set foot inside. The smell of rubber mats and iron weights was oddly comforting, but it also carried a sense of intimidation. He had no idea how to begin again, what his body was capable of. He could feel his muscles trembling with uncertainty as he approached the squat rack. He stood in front of the barbell, examining it for a moment. It was an old, familiar challenge. But this time, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to prove anything to himself. He just wanted to see where he was at. He loaded the barbell with only 40 pounds, the lightest weight he could handle for squats, and began to lower himself into the movement. It wasn't much. It was far from the days when he'd squat twice his body weight with ease, but it was enough. It was something. The burn in his legs was real, and he could feel his heart rate elevate. After a set of 10, Frank paused to catch his breath, feeling his muscles already beginning to complain. But this time, he didn't quit. He didn't push through in a way that would break his body. He stopped when it felt right, and he took a step back. When he finished the set, he stood up and wiped his forehead. He was winded, but not defeated. The gym wasn't the only place where Frank was seeing progress. At home, his energy levels had started to rise. He didn't feel as sluggish after a long day. He didn't need multiple cups of coffee just to make it through the afternoon. His mind was clearer. He'd even started reading again. Not technical manuals or business strategies, but books that sparked his interest, things that filled his soul rather than just his mind. He hadn't realized how much he had missed stories, how much they had once fueled his sense of wonder. Frank was finding balance. By the end of the week, he had reached a small but significant milestone. It wasn't just that he had walked longer or lifted more. It was that he had done it consistently. For the first time in ages, he was no longer an observer in his own life. He was living it. That morning, as he stood in front of the mirror again, he noticed something else, a subtle but noticeable change. His shoulders were broader, his posture straighter. His reflection looked stronger, more confident. It wasn't just his body that had transformed. Something inside him had shifted, something that could never be undone. Later that evening, Frank sat in his favorite armchair, his knees tucked up beneath him, with a cup of tea in his hand. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't stressed. For the first time in a long time, he was content with where he was, and for the first time in years, he felt pride in himself, not just in his work, but in his journey to reclaim his health. It had been a small victory, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. And the best part was, this victory was just the beginning. It was almost too good to be true. For weeks, Frank had felt the momentum building, a steady stream of progress that gave him a sense of control over his life. The small victories, those morning walks, the time spent in the gym, even the peace he felt at home, had begun to form a new reality. He was doing this. He was succeeding. But life has a way of reminding us that nothing is permanent. And as Frank was about to learn, not all victories are followed by a smooth path. The setback came on a Wednesday morning. Frank had woken up at 6 a.m., as usual, feeling a little more rested than he had in weeks. His knee had only a slight twinge, nothing that would hold him back, so he laced up his sneakers, grabbed his water bottle, and headed out for his walk. He had pushed his distance to a full hour now, and that morning he was determined to extend it even further. The first 20 minutes were easy. The cool breeze, the familiar rhythm of his footsteps, everything was in sync. He was smiling to himself, thinking about how far he'd come, when suddenly, the familiar pain in his right knee flared up. It wasn't a dull ache this time. It was sharp, piercing, and completely stopped him in his tracks. Frank winced, holding his knee for a moment, trying to catch his breath. He had been walking for 25 minutes when it hit him. It wasn't just discomfort, it was injury. He limped back home, his steps slower and more deliberate. Each movement felt like it took more effort than the last. By the time he reached his front door, the pain was still throbbing, and Frank knew, he wasn't going to be able to continue his routine for a while. Frank tried to stay calm as he sat on the edge of his bed, massaging his knee. The last thing he wanted was to let this derail his progress. He had worked so hard to get this far, and he wasn't about to let an injury set him back. He pulled out his phone and Googled knee pain in older adults, scrolling through articles and recommendations. Most of them suggested rest, ice, and compression. A few recommended physical therapy, but Frank wasn't sure if that was the route he wanted to take just yet. The idea of seeing a therapist made him feel like he was admitting defeat. It's just a bump in the road, he told himself. This happens. But even as he tried to convince himself, he felt a sinking feeling. What if this wasn't a small injury? What if this was the start of something bigger? A long-term problem that could change everything. For the next few days, Frank took it easy. He didn't push himself to do anything. His walks were reduced to slow, painful limps. His gym visits were out of the question. Instead, he spent more time reading, trying to distract himself from the growing frustration. But the nagging thought at the back of his mind wouldn't go away. Had he been too ambitious too soon? His body had been sending him signals for weeks, reminding him that he wasn't the man he used to be. And now, here he was, stuck in a painful reality that he had hoped to avoid. On the fourth day of his recovery, Frank reached out to Jason. The conversation had been brief but meaningful. "Dad, you need to see a doctor," Jason said, his tone concerned but calm. "This isn't just about resting it. You've got to know what you're dealing with before you make it worse." "I'm fine," Frank replied, trying to brush off the concern. "I'm just taking it easy. I'll be back on my feet in no time." Jason didn't buy it. "Dad, it's okay to take a break. You've been pushing hard for weeks. Just go see someone." Frank didn't like the idea of slowing down, but he knew his son was right. It was time to face the truth, even if it wasn't the outcome he wanted. The next morning, Frank found himself sitting in a small, sterile examination room at his local clinic. The walls were painted a pale green, and the smell of antiseptic hung faintly in the air. He hated it here. It reminded him of all the times he had ignored his health, assuming that if he worked harder, he could power through anything. But now, sitting in this room, he felt vulnerable. He wasn't in control anymore. The doctor walked in, a young woman with glasses and a calm demeanor. She smiled at Frank, but he could tell she wasn't here to give him good news. "Mr. Davis, I've looked over your X-rays," she began, sitting down across from him. "It appears you have some early signs of osteoarthritis in your knee. The good news is, it's not severe, yet. But with your activity level, you're putting a lot of strain on it. It's definitely something we need to address." Frank felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. He had hoped for a simple fix, maybe a sprain or just some tightness. But osteoarthritis? That was a serious condition, and it felt like a slap in the face. It was the first real reminder of how much he had neglected his body for so long. "Okay," Frank said, trying to hide the frustration in his voice. "What do I need to do?" The doctor explained that he would need to modify his routine. Physical therapy was essential, as was low-impact exercise. She suggested swimming, cycling, or even using an elliptical machine instead of walking long distances. Frank didn't like the idea of stepping away from his walks, those had been his escape, but he knew it was for the best. "Take it slow," she advised. "The more you push through the pain now, the worse it could get. Let's work together to create a plan that will keep you active without further damage." As Frank walked out of the clinic, the weight of the diagnosis hung heavy on his chest. The path he had been on was no longer just about fitness. It was about healing, physically and mentally. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. This setback wasn't the end of his journey. It was just another obstacle he needed to overcome. And with time, he would figure out how to navigate it. The days after the doctor's visit felt like a shift in the air for Frank. The reality of his osteoarthritis diagnosis settled in like an unwelcome guest, but he was determined not to let it consume him. It was easy to get lost in fear when confronted with the idea that his body was no longer what it used to be, but Frank knew one thing: he had to keep moving forward. Even if it meant changing the way he moved. After the doctor's advice to focus on low-impact activities, Frank spent the next few days doing what he could to process the situation. He researched swimming techniques online, scrolled through cycling forums, and even watched videos about people in their 50s and 60s staying active with joint issues. It was reassuring to see how many people had found ways to work around their conditions and continue living active lives. But it was still hard for Frank to shake the idea that he was being forced to slow down. His knee was healing, but it wasn't perfect. The idea of moving away from his walks, something he had enjoyed so much, left a bitter taste in his mouth. It felt like a betrayal to his own commitment to change. But as he sat in the living room one evening, watching the sunset and sipping a cup of chamomile tea, Frank realized that this was his new reality. Fighting it wouldn't get him anywhere. The question wasn't whether or not he could push through the pain, it was how he would adapt and keep moving in a way that respected his body's limits. The next morning, Frank woke up with a sense of purpose. He knew he couldn't just jump back into his usual routine. He had to reassess, recalibrate, and find a new path forward that would still allow him to feel the satisfaction of progress. He opened his laptop and started planning. The first thing on his list was physical therapy. The doctor had mentioned it was crucial for strengthening the muscles around his knee to help alleviate the pressure on the joint. Frank wasn't thrilled about the idea of committing to weekly sessions, but he knew it was necessary. It wasn't just about his knee, it was about taking his health seriously in ways he hadn't done before. Frank called a local clinic and set up an appointment. The first session would be focused on evaluation, where the therapist would assess his range of motion and create a customized plan. It felt like the right first step. Professional guidance would be a game changer, helping him build strength while managing his condition. Next, he made a list of low-impact activities. Swimming was at the top. He had always loved the idea of swimming, though it had been years since he'd last swum a full lap. The soft, gliding movements in the water would allow him to exercise without the harsh impact on his joints. He also considered the elliptical machine, which he could use at home without having to travel to the gym. Frank made a mental note to start small. Instead of diving straight into hour-long swims, he would aim for short sessions, focusing on proper form and gradually increasing his time in the water. He knew consistency was key. That afternoon, Frank went out and purchased a new pair of swim trunks. It felt strange, this new approach to exercise, but as he held the trunks in his hands, he couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement. This was something new, something that didn't require him to push his body beyond its limits, but rather, to listen to it. It wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. As he walked out of the store, he texted Jason. "Got my new swim trunks. Ready for the pool tomorrow. Thanks for pushing me." Jason replied almost instantly. "Glad you're making the change, Dad. You've got this." Frank smiled. His son had been his biggest cheerleader in this journey, and it made all the difference. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so supported in a personal challenge. The next morning, Frank arrived at the community pool early. The air was crisp, the water gleaming under the morning sun. There was something peaceful about the poolside, the stillness of the water broken only by the soft sound of splashing. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the pool. It was intimidating, in a way. There were a few older adults swimming laps, and Frank felt a little self-conscious. But then he thought about his goal. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He was there to take care of himself, to do something that would improve his health and keep him moving forward. Frank slipped into the water, feeling the cool embrace as it closed around him. His legs felt weightless. The familiar tug of gravity was gone. He took a deep breath and began to swim. It wasn't fast. It wasn't perfect. But it was something. He swam one lap, then two. After a brief rest at the edge of the pool, he went for a third. By the time he finished his fifth lap, Frank felt something unexpected: pride. He had done something new. He had stepped out of his comfort zone and faced the challenge head-on. In the weeks that followed, Frank continued to swim, slowly building up his stamina. Each session was an improvement on the last, and with each lap, he could feel his body growing stronger. His knee didn't hurt as much anymore, and his movements felt more fluid. Swimming wasn't just a low-impact exercise, it was a full-body workout that allowed him to build endurance without exacerbating his joint pain. He also kept up with his physical therapy sessions. The therapist worked with him to strengthen the muscles around his knee, incorporating exercises that focused on balance and mobility. Frank was surprised at how much he enjoyed the sessions. It wasn't just the physical progress, it was the feeling of being cared for. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't doing it alone. As the weeks passed, Frank could see the results. He was losing weight again, his muscles were more defined, and his energy levels were higher. He felt a sense of accomplishment with every session at the pool, every physical therapy visit, and even the smaller wins, like walking without pain or bending down to tie his shoes without stiffness. But the most significant change wasn't physical, it was mental. Frank was beginning to embrace the process. He had stopped worrying about how fast he could get back to where he was. He had let go of the idea of perfection. Instead, he focused on making small, consistent improvements, day by day. And with every step forward, the doubts and fears seemed to fade just a little more. Frank had always been a bit of a lone wolf. His early life had instilled in him a sense of independence. Growing up, his father had been a tough, no-nonsense kind of man, teaching him that if you wanted something done, you had to do it yourself. There was no room for relying on others. That mentality had followed Frank into adulthood, pushing him to tackle life's challenges head-on without asking for help. But as the years passed, Frank began to realize something important: doing it alone wasn't always the best option. It was a hard lesson to learn, especially when it came to something as personal and vital as his health. When Frank's knee pain flared up, he had tried to power through it by himself. He didn't want to admit that he needed help or that his body wasn't the machine it once was. But after the injury, after the diagnosis, something shifted. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that maybe this time, asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a sign of strength. Jason had been a major support system for Frank from the very beginning. His son had encouraged him to seek professional help when the knee pain first started, and since then, he had checked in regularly, offering words of encouragement and advice. Frank appreciated it, even if he didn't always admit it out loud. The thing was, Frank wasn't used to leaning on others. He wasn't used to asking for advice, sharing his struggles, or being vulnerable in front of his family or friends. But as his knee injury lingered, Frank realized that he couldn't keep this to himself. His journey was bigger than just him now, it was about the people around him as well. That's when Frank started opening up more. He told Jason about his struggles at the pool, about how it felt like he was starting over, and how frustrating it was to adjust to this new, slower pace. Jason listened, offering encouragement. It wasn't long before Frank felt the weight of his isolation lift, just a little. But Jason wasn't the only one offering support. One afternoon, as Frank was heading to his physical therapy session, he ran into his neighbor, Linda. Linda was in her late 60s, an avid walker, and someone Frank had exchanged pleasantries with over the years. They'd often waved to each other across their yards, but they hadn't spent much time together. "How's the knee doing, Frank?" Linda asked as she watered her plants. Frank shrugged, trying to hide his frustration. "It's getting better. Slowly. I'm just taking it one day at a time." Linda smiled knowingly. "You know, I've been dealing with arthritis in my hip for years. It's a journey, but I've learned a lot along the way. If you ever need someone to talk to or if you want to join me for a walk, I'd be happy to have you." Frank paused. The offer was unexpected but genuine. For a moment, he hesitated. He wasn't used to reaching out to people, especially for help or support. But something about Linda's kindness made him feel comfortable. "Thanks, Linda," Frank said. "I might take you up on that." Over the next few weeks, Linda and Frank started walking together a couple of times a week. Their walks were easy and slow, just a few laps around the block, but Frank found them surprisingly refreshing. He hadn't realized how much he missed social connection, how much he missed having someone to share small moments with. As they walked, they talked about everything, their families, their childhoods, their experiences with aging, and how they were learning to navigate the challenges that came with getting older. Linda's insight was invaluable. She had been living with arthritis for years and had learned to adapt in ways Frank hadn't even considered. One day, after their walk, Linda shared a piece of advice that stuck with Frank. "You know, Frank," she said, "the hardest part isn't the pain. It's the fear that comes with it. The fear of not being able to do what you used to. The fear of losing independence. But the truth is, there's a lot we can still do. We just have to approach it differently." Frank thought about that for a long time after their walk. Linda was right. It wasn't just about the physical limitations, it was about the mental game. The fear that had been holding him back was bigger than the injury itself. The idea of losing his independence, of not being able to do things on his own, had been a major source of his anxiety. Around this same time, Frank also started reconnecting with an old friend, Tom, who he hadn't seen in years. They had worked together in the past and had kept in touch over social media, but the friendship had faded as they got busier with their lives. Tom had been following Frank's fitness journey on Facebook and had reached out to see how he was doing. "I saw you've been swimming lately," Tom said when they spoke on the phone. "That's awesome. I've been trying to get back into the gym myself. Maybe we can meet up for a workout or something." Frank hadn't really considered going to the gym with someone else. The thought of having a workout buddy was a little foreign, but the idea of having someone to share the process with was also appealing. He agreed to meet Tom the next week for a casual workout. The day of the workout, Frank felt nervous. What if he wasn't in good enough shape? What if he held Tom back? But when they met at the gym, Tom was encouraging and laid back, and the session was less about pushing hard and more about supporting each other. They spent an hour on the elliptical, followed by some light weightlifting. As they worked out, they caught up on life and shared stories about their kids, careers, and what they were learning as they got older. Frank felt a sense of camaraderie he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was then that he realized, the social aspect of fitness was just as important as the physical part. Over the next few months, Frank's social circle around fitness grew. His walks with Linda turned into longer excursions, and he started meeting with Tom once a week for gym sessions. He also began participating in local fitness events, like charity runs and group yoga sessions. But the most significant change wasn't in his physical health, it was in his mental well-being. Frank had learned that asking for help and surrounding himself with a support system didn't make him weak. It made him stronger. The people around him weren't just a crutch, they were partners in his journey. They offered advice, shared experiences, and gave him the encouragement he needed to keep going when things got tough. For Frank, it wasn't just about the knee injury anymore. It was about realizing that, sometimes, the greatest strength came from vulnerability, the willingness to let others in and share the load. And with each day, Frank felt less alone in his journey. At some point during Frank's recovery, something shifted. It wasn't just his knee that was healing, it was his mindset. He had spent so many years focused on a singular idea of what it meant to be fit. He had long equated fitness with strength, speed, and pushing through any pain. But now, with the pain in his knee and the limitations it imposed, Frank had to redefine what fitness meant to him. The days of running marathons or hiking rugged trails seemed like a distant memory, but there was still a deep desire to stay active, to keep moving. It wasn't about pushing his body beyond its limits anymore, it was about adapting to his new reality and finding ways to stay healthy and engaged without letting fear or frustration take over. Frank wasn't alone in this journey. Linda's words continued to echo in his mind, the hardest part isn't the pain. It's the fear that comes with it. That was it. Fear had been controlling his actions for so long. The fear that he would never be able to do the things he loved again. The fear that his age, coupled with the arthritis, would trap him in a life of limitations. But Frank had learned something important, fear didn't have to control him. The more Frank thought about it, the more he realized that in every challenge, there was a choice. He could either let the fear and pain define his journey, or he could choose to see the obstacles as opportunities for growth. And so, Frank began to change his mindset. He stopped focusing on what he couldn't do and started thinking about what he could do. Each day became less about fighting the inevitable changes that came with aging and more about embracing the new path. The first time Frank noticed this shift in action was during his swimming sessions. At first, he had dreaded the idea of swimming laps. It seemed so foreign to him, a far cry from his long walks and the high-intensity workouts he had once loved. But as he spent more time in the water, he realized how liberating it felt. The water supported him in a way that running never had. It was a fluid, weightless experience that allowed him to focus on form and technique rather than the pain in his knees. His swimming was slow at first, but each lap gave him a sense of accomplishment. He didn't need to compete with anyone. He was only racing against his own doubts. As the weeks passed, Frank noticed changes not just in his body but in his thoughts. He began to enjoy the process. The pressure to perform or achieve a certain result faded. Instead, Frank found himself celebrating small victories, being able to swim an extra lap, feeling less discomfort in his knees, or simply enjoying the rhythm of the water. The more he let go of the need for perfection, the more he could appreciate the small moments of progress. Frank realized that his health wasn't about a destination, it was about the journey. And that journey could be full of unexpected joys and insights if he embraced the change, rather than resisting it. One morning, as Frank sat by his kitchen window, sipping coffee, he had a revelation. It wasn't just about fitness anymore, it was about life itself. The way he approached fitness was a reflection of the way he approached life. In his younger years, Frank had always pushed hard, believing that grit and perseverance were the only ways to succeed. But now, at 51, he realized that balance was the key. It wasn't about brute force, it was about resilience, adaptability, and listening to his body. Instead of focusing on what he had lost, his ability to hike long distances or run without pain, he started focusing on what he had gained. New opportunities, like swimming and cycling, had opened up for him. And most importantly, he had learned to be kinder to himself. That afternoon, Frank met with Jason for lunch. As they sat down at their usual diner, Jason noticed the change in his father. Frank looked different, not just in his appearance but in the way he carried himself. "You okay, Dad?" Jason asked, noticing his father's thoughtful expression. Frank smiled. It was the kind of smile that came from a place of contentment. "Yeah, I'm good. Actually, better than I've been in a while." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Better? How so?" "I've been thinking about how I've been looking at things," Frank explained. "For years, I focused so much on pushing through, on never admitting weakness. But now I'm realizing that maybe the key to staying healthy isn't about pushing harder, but about being more mindful." Jason listened, impressed. "Sounds like you've made a pretty big shift. What's been the biggest change for you?" Frank thought for a moment before answering. "It's not about trying to go back to what I was. It's about figuring out what I can do now. And making peace with that. I can still be active. I can still be fit. But it's going to look different than before." Jason nodded. "That's actually really insightful, Dad. I think we all have to make those kinds of shifts as we get older." That night, Frank sat in front of the TV, a rare moment of quiet in his life. As he flipped through channels, he stopped on a documentary about older athletes who had continued to compete at high levels despite physical challenges. Frank had seen this type of story before, but tonight, it resonated differently. The athletes weren't glorifying their physical feats, instead, they were talking about the wisdom they had gained over the years. One former marathon runner, now in his 70s, said something that stuck with Frank: "The real challenge isn't the body, it's the mind. It's about learning to adapt to the changes and seeing what you're capable of now, not what you used to be." Frank smiled as the words echoed in his mind. It was exactly what he was learning. He didn't have to be the man he had been in his 30s or 40s. He could be the man he was now, and that man could still do great things. It was just a matter of adapting. In the weeks that followed, Frank embraced this new perspective. He stopped comparing himself to his younger self and started comparing himself to the man he was yesterday. He saw each day as an opportunity to do better, to push forward, and to embrace the changes that came with age. He could still be strong, but it wasn't about brute force. It was about wisdom, the wisdom to listen to his body, to adapt to his circumstances, and to keep moving forward with intention. Frank had learned that real strength wasn't about never changing, it was about having the courage to embrace change and the resilience to thrive in the face of it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank's progress had been steady. His knee pain had improved, his swimming was becoming more fluid, and his mindset had shifted into a place of growth and adaptability. For the first time in a long while, he felt as though he was in control of his health, embracing each challenge with the resilience he had learned to cultivate. But, as often happens in life, a setback was lurking around the corner. It came on a Wednesday morning, just as Frank was preparing for a swim session at the local pool. He had felt a little stiff when he woke up, but nothing too concerning. As he bent down to tie his shoes, he felt a sharp twinge in his lower back. It was sudden and unexpected, a wave of pain that sent a shock through his body. Frank straightened up quickly, wincing as he placed a hand on his back. He knew better than to ignore it, especially after everything he had been through with his knee. He tried a few gentle stretches, hoping the stiffness would dissipate, but the pain only intensified. "I guess this is just part of getting older," he muttered to himself. But deep down, he felt a surge of frustration building up inside of him. After everything he had been working toward, his swimming, his focus on mental resilience, this new pain was a cruel reminder that the body, no matter how hard you fight for it, has its limits. Frank cancelled his swim for the day and opted to take it easy. But as the hours passed, the pain in his back didn't subside. It became a constant, nagging reminder of his age and his limitations. The next morning, the pain was still there, stiff and aching. He called his physical therapist, Sarah, and scheduled an appointment. When he arrived at Sarah's clinic, she took a look at his back and gave him a reassuring smile, though Frank could tell she was concerned. "We're going to take a closer look at this," she said, guiding him to the treatment table. "Sometimes, when we adjust our workout routines, especially as we age, our bodies can react in ways we don't expect. Let's figure out what's going on." Sarah worked with Frank on a series of stretches and gentle movements, but the results weren't immediate. The pain persisted, and Sarah suggested that Frank might have aggravated a muscle in his lower back, something that was more common with his specific injury pattern. She recommended rest and a few weeks of more targeted therapy. Frank left the clinic that day feeling disheartened. Just as he was beginning to feel confident about his progress, this new setback made him question everything. He had already dealt with his knee, and now his back was giving him trouble. Was this going to be his life now, constantly battling one injury after another? He sat in his car for a moment, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His initial reaction was one of defeat, but he quickly reminded himself of everything he had learned over the past few months. He wasn't going to let this setback dictate his journey. He had faced worse before, and he had come out stronger. For the first time, Frank realized that this moment, though frustrating, was also a chance for growth. The pain in his back wasn't just an obstacle, it was an opportunity to adapt. To listen to his body more closely and be even more mindful of how he was moving and caring for himself. Over the next few days, Frank focused on gentle movements, stretching, and resting. He didn't let the pain keep him down for long. He still kept up with his walking sessions with Linda, albeit at a slower pace. They began focusing more on balance and stretching during their walks. Linda had been dealing with her own set of physical challenges for years, and her wisdom and patience helped Frank put things into perspective. "You know," Linda said one afternoon as they walked along their usual route, "I used to get so upset every time something went wrong with my body. But now, I've learned to just take it one step at a time. If I have a bad day, I don't beat myself up about it. I just do my best the next day." Frank nodded, absorbing the advice. It was something he had needed to hear. Perfection wasn't the goal. The goal was to keep going, even on the difficult days. To be patient with himself, and to recognize that every setback was just a chapter in a much bigger story. During the next few weeks, Frank worked closely with Sarah on strengthening his back muscles, doing exercises to improve his flexibility, and learning how to protect his joints from strain. He didn't push himself too hard, but he gradually began to see improvement. The pain lessened, and his confidence returned. But it wasn't just his back that had healed. Frank had learned something invaluable during this period of rest and recovery. True strength comes not from avoiding setbacks, but from how you respond to them. He began to see his challenges in a new light. Every injury, every obstacle, was not a failure, it was a chance to learn, to adapt, and to grow. One evening, as Frank sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on the journey he had been on. The road had not been smooth. There had been twists and turns, moments of frustration, and setbacks that felt like they might be the end of the road. But each time he faced a challenge, he came out of it stronger and wiser. "I'm not done yet," he whispered to himself. "I'm just getting started." As Frank's back pain continued to improve, he returned to swimming and slowly increased the intensity of his workouts. But now, every stroke, every step, felt more meaningful. He was no longer focused on being the man he once was, he was focused on becoming the best version of himself at this stage of his life. And with each passing day, he realized that the journey wasn't just about physical health. It was about the mindset. It was about embracing change, learning from setbacks, and adapting with strength and resilience. The true key to staying fit at 51 was not simply about how hard you could push, but about how well you could adapt, learn, and grow through the challenges life threw at you. As Frank's recovery from his back pain continued to progress, he began to realize just how much power routine held in his life. For years, he had jumped from one fitness trend to the next, hoping that some new workout or diet would hold the key to feeling better, stronger, and more energetic. But now, after overcoming setbacks and embracing his changing body, Frank understood that true consistency was what would carry him through the long term. He had already learned that achieving his fitness goals wasn't about being perfect or pushing to extremes. It was about building a daily practice that worked with his body, not against it. And the more he looked at the world around him, the more he saw that the people who were happiest and healthiest were those who had developed strong, supportive routines that nourished both their bodies and minds. One of the first things Frank focused on was his morning routine. For most of his life, mornings had been chaotic, a rush of getting the kids ready, grabbing a quick coffee, and diving straight into work. But as he moved into his 50s, Frank realized that how he started his day could set the tone for everything that followed. He began to wake up a little earlier, taking the time to enjoy a cup of coffee in silence, reflecting on what he wanted to achieve for the day. For Frank, these moments of peace were essential. They allowed him to set clear intentions for his health and fitness, to mentally prepare for whatever challenges the day might bring. Next, he started integrating light stretching into his mornings. At first, it was simple, just a few gentle stretches to wake up his muscles and loosen up his body. But these stretches quickly became a vital part of his routine, helping him stay limber and prevent any aches and pains from starting the day off on the wrong foot. Linda had always encouraged him to think of his morning as an opportunity for self-care. She explained how, over the years, she had come to see her morning routine as sacred. "It's not just about physical activity," she had told Frank. "It's about taking time to center yourself and prioritize your well-being. You can't pour from an empty cup." As weeks passed, Frank realized that his morning routine was only one piece of the puzzle. He began to focus on creating habits that would support his overall well-being. He wasn't trying to completely overhaul his life all at once. Instead, he took small, deliberate steps to add healthier practices into his daily routine. First, he set a goal to incorporate at least 30 minutes of exercise every day. It didn't matter if it was swimming, walking, or stretching, it just had to be something that kept him moving. The consistency of these small workouts kept him motivated, and over time, they became a natural part of his day, something he looked forward to rather than dreaded. He also began to track his meals. Frank wasn't about to start following restrictive diets, but he realized that by paying more attention to what he was eating, he could make healthier choices without feeling deprived. Linda, ever the wellness advocate, shared her knowledge about mindful eating. It wasn't just about what he ate, but how he ate. Frank started to eat more slowly, savoring his meals, and paying attention to how certain foods made him feel. The way you nourish yourself affects more than just your body, Linda had said. It affects your energy, your mood, and even your mindset. When you eat mindfully, you're making a conscious choice to care for yourself. For a long time, Frank had believed that rest was for the weak. He was a man of action, someone who pushed through discomfort and kept moving forward no matter what. But after all the setbacks, his knee injury, his back pain, his struggles with mental resilience, Frank learned that rest was just as important as any workout or training session. He started giving himself permission to take breaks. He scheduled time for rest, ensuring that he wasn't overexerting himself. When he felt tired, he allowed himself to recharge without guilt. Sleep became a priority. He stopped staying up late working on projects or scrolling through his phone. Instead, he began to create a bedtime routine that helped him wind down. He avoided screens an hour before bed, read a book, and practiced deep breathing exercises to calm his mind. It didn't take long for Frank to notice the improvements. His energy levels increased, his workouts felt more effective, and his mindset shifted. Rest wasn't a sign of weakness, it was an essential tool for recovery, for healing, and for sustainable growth. As Frank continued to refine his routine, he realized that it wasn't just the big goals that mattered, it was the small wins that built momentum. Each time he showed up for his morning stretches, each time he made a healthier food choice, or took the time to rest when he needed it, he was winning. It was these little moments of consistency that added up over time, creating a foundation for true, lasting change. Frank no longer measured his success by how fast he could swim a lap or how far he could walk in one session. Instead, he started to measure his progress by his ability to stick with his routine, day after day, regardless of how small the action seemed. One afternoon, as Frank sat on his porch, enjoying a quiet moment with a cup of tea, he reflected on how far he had come. A year ago, he had been struggling to find his footing after his knee injury. Now, he had created a solid routine that supported his physical, mental, and emotional well-being. It wasn't about achieving some grand, elusive goal, it was about finding balance, creating habits that worked for him, and being kind to himself along the way. What's the secret to staying fit at 51? Frank thought to himself. It wasn't about extreme workouts or pushing his body past its limits. It was about embracing the power of routine, staying consistent, and recognizing that each small action led to larger, long-term results. He smiled to himself. It wasn't always easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But Frank was learning to embrace them. He was no longer trying to escape his age or fight against his body. Instead, he was working with it, building a life of health and wellness that could carry him well into the future. Frank had settled into a rhythm. His daily routine, now solid and sustainable, had become second nature. There was a sense of calm that came with knowing what each day would bring, how he would nourish his body and mind, and how he would rise to meet the challenges of aging with strength and patience. However, life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, and Frank was about to experience a victory that he hadn't anticipated, one that came from within. It was a cool morning when Frank felt something shift inside him. He had just wrapped up a stretching session on the porch, his usual start to the day, when Linda called. "Hey, Frank, how are you holding up today?" Her voice was light, but Frank could hear the curiosity in her tone. "I'm doing all right," Frank replied, pulling himself back into his chair after his stretches. "My back's still sore, but I'm pushing through. Routine's been keeping me steady, though." Linda paused for a moment. "That's good to hear. But you know, sometimes the biggest victories are the ones we don't see at first." Frank chuckled, unsure of where the conversation was going. "What do you mean by that?" "Well," Linda continued, "a lot of times, we think the only victories worth celebrating are the big, obvious ones, the physical milestones. But there's so much strength in the things we can't see. The mental and emotional growth, the resilience we build when we just keep going, even when things feel tough. Those are victories too, even if they don't show up on a fitness tracker." Frank leaned back, letting her words settle in. He had been so focused on his physical health, on improving his strength, on healing his injuries, that he hadn't really stopped to consider how much he had changed on the inside. As Frank thought about Linda's words, he realized how much he had grown in terms of his mindset. In the past, whenever he encountered setbacks, he would become frustrated and discouraged. It was easy to fall into the trap of thinking that if you weren't seeing immediate results, you weren't progressing at all. But now, as he reflected on the months that had passed, he understood that the true measure of progress wasn't always in the physical results. The victory was in the mindset shift. He had stopped beating himself up for not being able to return to his former physical condition. He had stopped comparing himself to others, whether they were younger, fitter, or more agile. Instead, he had learned to accept where he was and to embrace the journey, rather than focusing on the destination. This was no easy feat for Frank, who had always been someone to push hard and expect perfection. But the consistency of his routine had led to a deep sense of mental fortitude. He no longer saw every obstacle as a failure. He saw them as opportunities to adapt and grow. In fact, Frank realized that the true strength was in his ability to keep moving forward, even when the progress was slow or unseen. As the days passed, Frank began to notice little things that proved Linda's point. For instance, when he went to the pool for his regular swim session, he no longer felt anxious about not being able to swim as fast as he used to. Instead, he enjoyed the rhythm of the water, the peace it brought him, and the sense of accomplishment from simply showing up. He wasn't trying to break records anymore, he was simply honoring his body. One morning, after a walk with Linda, they sat on a bench overlooking a serene park. Frank had just shared his recent revelation about the unseen victories when Linda nodded thoughtfully. "You know, Frank, sometimes we focus so much on the physical results that we forget how much the mind influences everything. When your mind is at peace, when you're not constantly battling with yourself, you free up your energy to really focus on what matters, nourishing yourself, enjoying life, and taking care of the people you love." Frank smiled, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the wisdom Linda had shared with him. Over the months, she had become more than a walking partner, she had become a teacher, showing him how to navigate aging with grace, patience, and mindfulness. That evening, as Frank sat alone in his study, he reflected on how far he had come. It wasn't just about the knee injury or the back pain anymore. It wasn't about how many laps he could swim or how much weight he could lift. He realized that his journey was about something much deeper. The physical setbacks were just markers, temporary challenges along the way. But his true growth had come from within. It was the mental strength he had built, the emotional resilience that had been forged through his struggles, that mattered most. For the first time in years, Frank was at peace with himself. He didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. He had accepted his limitations, and in doing so, he had unlocked a level of strength that was invisible, yet incredibly powerful. One of the most significant shifts in Frank's journey had been his growing sense of gratitude. He had learned to appreciate the small things, the quiet moments on the porch, the soothing rhythm of his walks with Linda, and the simple act of stretching every morning. It wasn't just about being grateful for the physical victories anymore. Frank had begun to practice gratitude for the strength he had found within himself. The resilience. The mental toughness. The ability to continue moving forward, even on days when it seemed like the world was at odds with him. As Frank's reflections deepened, he realized that this newfound peace was the unexpected victory he had been seeking. It wasn't something he could measure on a fitness tracker or record in his training log. It wasn't something that could be seen on the surface. But it was the victory that mattered the most, the victory that came when he learned to embrace his journey, to find strength in the unseen, and to live each day with intention, gratitude, and resilience. As he closed his eyes and took a deep breath, Frank smiled. He had found a strength deeper than he had ever imagined, and it wasn't just in his body. It was in his heart and mind. And that was a victory he could carry with him for the rest of his life. Frank had always known that the people in his life had an impact on his happiness and well-being. But over the course of his journey, something had shifted. He realized that the strength of his relationships could be just as powerful as the strength of his body. It wasn't just about physical health anymore, it was about emotional, mental, and even social well-being. And as he looked back at the changes he had made over the past year, he understood something crucial: the quality of his relationships played a huge role in his ability to stay fit and positive at 51. As Frank sat in his living room one Saturday afternoon, his wife, Susan, walked into the room, holding a cup of tea for him. She had always been his anchor, the steady hand that held him together through the ups and downs of life. They had been married for over 25 years, and their relationship had evolved into one built on mutual respect, trust, and deep love. But it wasn't always easy. Like any couple, they had gone through their share of struggles. Yet, looking back now, Frank knew that their bond had been a cornerstone of his ability to keep going. Susan had been his greatest supporter. When Frank was frustrated with his injuries, when he doubted his progress, it was Susan who always reminded him of the bigger picture. She was the one who made sure he didn't push too hard, but also encouraged him to keep moving forward. Her gentle but firm reminders about balance and self-compassion had been instrumental in his recovery. "Is everything okay?" Susan asked, her voice soft with concern. Frank smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Yeah, everything's great. Just thinking about how much you've helped me through all of this. I couldn't have done it without you." She sat beside him, a warm smile on her face. "I think we've helped each other. But you've really done the hard work, Frank. You've been consistent, you've shown up every day. I'm proud of you." That simple exchange reminded Frank of how essential their connection was to his health. Their relationship wasn't just about love, it was about partnership, about building each other up and leaning on each other during times of difficulty. But it wasn't just family that played a key role in Frank's health journey. Over the years, he had also forged strong friendships that had helped shape his approach to fitness and well-being. One of those friends was Mark, his old college roommate, who had always been the fitness enthusiast of the group. Mark had been the one to introduce Frank to weightlifting back in their 20s. And though Frank had gone through various phases of fitness over the years, it was Mark who had remained a steady presence in his life. The two had spent countless hours working out together, laughing about old memories, and sharing their personal goals. However, after Frank's injuries, their workouts had become less frequent. Mark, ever the motivator, could have easily pushed Frank to go beyond his limits. But instead, he adapted to Frank's pace, joining him on walks or gentle stretching sessions when Frank couldn't do the high-intensity routines they used to enjoy. One evening, Frank and Mark were having dinner at his house. Mark was sharing stories of his recent hiking trips, while Frank listened intently. Despite their different approaches to fitness, Mark always on the go, seeking adventure, there was something incredibly grounding about having a friend who understood the importance of patience in the process. "You know," Mark said, "the thing I've learned the most over the years is that the people you surround yourself with really shape who you become. I've seen you grow in ways I never expected. Your mindset, your resilience, it's inspiring." Frank looked at his friend with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mark. You've always pushed me to think beyond my limits, and now, I'm learning that those limits are just temporary. They don't define me." Frank also recognized that his social network, the community he was a part of, played a significant role in his health. Over the years, he had learned to surround himself with people who supported his values, who were positive influences, and who encouraged him to take care of himself. He was no longer interested in toxic relationships or negative energy. Linda, his walking partner, was another important part of his circle. She had been there from the beginning, offering her wisdom on health and wellness, and helping Frank find balance when everything else seemed overwhelming. Their weekly walks had become a ritual for both of them, an opportunity to connect, share their thoughts, and recharge mentally and emotionally. Through their conversations, Linda had helped Frank shift his perspective on fitness. She was the one who encouraged him to think about wellness as a holistic approach, one that combined physical exercise, mental clarity, emotional health, and meaningful connections. One morning, as they strolled along the park's winding paths, Linda asked Frank, "Have you ever thought about how much your emotional well-being impacts your physical health?" Frank paused. "Honestly, I never really considered it before. But now, I see how everything is connected. When I feel good mentally and emotionally, I have so much more energy. I'm more motivated to exercise, to eat well, to get rest. It's all intertwined." Linda smiled. "Exactly. Our relationships are a huge part of that. The people who lift us up, who make us feel seen and heard, have a profound impact on our health. They keep us grounded and give us the strength to face life's challenges." Research supports what Frank had learned through experience: human connection is vital to health. Studies show that strong social ties can improve life expectancy, reduce stress, and even boost immune function. On the other hand, social isolation can lead to an increased risk of various health problems, including cardiovascular disease, depression, and anxiety. Frank had felt the truth of these studies firsthand. It wasn't just about hitting the gym or swimming laps in the pool, it was about sharing his journey with others, leaning on his loved ones, and maintaining those close relationships that made him feel connected to the world around him. As Frank continued to reflect on the role of relationships in his health journey, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the people who had supported him: Susan, Mark, Linda, and even his extended circle of friends and family. They had taught him that health wasn't just about the body, it was about building a life rich in connections, filled with people who understood and supported him. Together, these relationships had been the unsung heroes of his fitness journey. They had given him the strength to face obstacles, to grow in new ways, and to build a life of wellness that extended far beyond the physical. Now, more than ever, Frank understood that togetherness was a key component of well-being. It wasn't just the sweat from a workout or the calories burned that mattered, it was the love, support, and understanding of the people around him that made all the difference. As Frank's journey continued, he found himself confronting a question he had avoided for years: what does it mean to truly embrace aging? It wasn't something he had ever thought about in depth, not until recently. For most of his life, the goal had always been to stay young, to remain strong and capable as time passed. But now, with every creaking joint and every stiff muscle, Frank knew that he could no longer ignore the passage of time. Yet, rather than dreading it, Frank began to see aging as a new chapter in his life, a stage in which he could continue to grow, evolve, and discover new strengths. In fact, he began to realize that the real beauty of aging wasn't in holding on to youth but in accepting the wisdom and inner strength that came with it. One evening, as Frank sat on his porch, watching the sunset, he reflected on how much his perspective had changed. In the past, he had been so focused on staying young, on defying the natural process of aging, that he had overlooked the richness that each stage of life could bring. But now, after months of dedication to his physical health and deep introspection, Frank had come to see aging as a privilege, not something to fear or fight against. His body had changed over the years, there were aches, pains, and limitations that weren't there when he was younger. But with those changes came new lessons. Aging had taught Frank patience, resilience, and acceptance. He had learned that strength wasn't just about being able to run a marathon or lift heavy weights, it was about showing up for life each day, regardless of what challenges came his way. Frank had always admired older individuals who seemed to carry themselves with such grace and wisdom. His grandfather, for instance, had been someone Frank looked up to as a child. He had seen him as a quiet, strong man who faced the challenges of old age with a calm acceptance that Frank could never fully understand, until now. Aging had a way of stripping away the superficial concerns of youth, Frank realized. It revealed the things that truly mattered: relationships, purpose, and the ability to find peace within oneself. While his body wasn't as agile as it used to be, his mind had grown sharper. His ability to reflect and adapt had made him more self-aware and more connected to his inner self. One of the most powerful realizations Frank had was that aging didn't have to mean slowing down in every area of life. It was about finding balance, understanding the rhythms of his body, acknowledging his limits, and choosing to live in alignment with those limits. Frank didn't need to compete with his younger self. He simply needed to embrace the process, appreciating each day for what it brought. Frank's fitness routine had shifted along with his changing body. While he had once been obsessed with pushing himself to new limits, he now focused on adapting his exercise to meet his body where it was. He incorporated more flexibility exercises, gentle yoga, and low-impact cardio. These changes weren't about weakness, they were about wisdom. Frank had learned that the best way to stay strong was not to fight against the inevitable aging process, but to work with it. At the same time, he found a new sense of appreciation for the movements he had once taken for granted. The act of stretching his body, of gently twisting and bending, brought him a sense of connection to his physical form that he hadn't fully understood before. There was a deep satisfaction in moving with purpose, not to prove anything, but simply to stay in tune with his body. This shift in mindset wasn't limited to his fitness routine. It extended to his daily life. Frank had started to savor moments of quiet reflection, and he spent more time enjoying the small joys of life. A warm cup of coffee in the morning, a deep conversation with a friend, or simply watching the sunset, these moments became treasures. He didn't feel the need to rush through them anymore. Frank had always been a man of action. He had spent most of his life pushing himself, striving for more success, more achievements, more strength. But as he aged, he began to realize that acceptance was just as important as ambition. Learning to accept his changing body, his limitations, and his evolving needs had brought him a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He no longer saw his wrinkles, his gray hair, or the aches in his knees as signs of decline. Instead, they were symbols of his life lived fully, of the experiences that had shaped him. Each wrinkle told a story, each gray hair marked a milestone. Frank's body had carried him through decades of work, love, joy, and loss, and it deserved gratitude, not criticism. This realization led Frank to a deep sense of self-compassion. He stopped being so hard on himself. When he couldn't do something as well as he used to, he didn't get frustrated. Instead, he accepted it, found joy in what he could do, and celebrated those small victories. One of the greatest discoveries Frank made in his journey through aging was the importance of having a sense of purpose. Throughout his life, he had been driven by external markers of success, his career, his achievements, his fitness goals. But now, he understood that having a purpose wasn't about proving anything to others, it was about meaning. He found purpose in the simple things, spending quality time with his family, mentoring younger people in his community, and continuing to challenge himself in healthy ways. Purpose gave him the drive to get out of bed in the morning, to keep moving, and to keep growing. Frank also realized that his purpose had expanded to include helping others understand the aging process. He shared his experiences with his children, his friends, and anyone who would listen. He encouraged them to embrace aging, not as something to fear, but as an opportunity to grow and experience life in new, meaningful ways. Now, as Frank looked ahead to the future, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He understood that aging wasn't a loss, but a gift. It was a chance to live more intentionally, to find strength in the midst of challenges, and to embrace each moment for the treasure that it was. Frank smiled as he thought about his journey. He had learned to love his body at every stage, to embrace his mind as it matured, and to celebrate the wisdom that came with age. And in doing so, he had discovered the true power of aging, the strength to keep going, to keep learning, and to live fully, no matter the number of years behind him. Frank had always known that eating healthy was important. But over the course of his fitness journey, he had come to understand something far more profound: nutrition was the foundation of longevity. It wasn't just about looking good or losing weight, it was about fueling his body for the long haul. As he entered his 50s, Frank realized that what he put into his body could either support his fitness goals or undermine them. And if he wanted to maintain his energy, strength, and vitality well into old age, nutrition had to be a priority. For years, Frank had followed the typical diet mentality, restricting calories, avoiding fats, and following the latest trends that promised quick results. But as he began to embrace the idea of long-term health over short-term gains, his approach to food shifted. It wasn't about depriving himself or following fads. It was about giving his body the best possible fuel to thrive at every age. As he researched more about the role of nutrition in aging, Frank learned that the body's nutritional needs changed over time. The metabolism slowed, muscle mass naturally declined, and the body's ability to absorb certain nutrients diminished. This made it even more important to focus on foods that supported muscle maintenance, bone health, heart function, and overall well-being. One of the most significant changes Frank made was increasing his protein intake. He had always been aware of protein's role in building muscle, but he hadn't realized just how important it was for preserving muscle mass as he aged. After hitting 50, he learned that maintaining muscle wasn't just about looking strong, it was about maintaining mobility and preventing falls, two crucial aspects of aging well. Frank made sure his meals included high-quality sources of protein, lean meats, fish, eggs, and plant-based options like beans and legumes. He started incorporating protein-rich snacks throughout the day, such as Greek yogurt or protein shakes, to keep his muscles fueled and to prevent any loss of lean mass. Muscle loss is inevitable as we age, Frank had read in one of his nutrition articles. But with the right diet and exercise, we can slow it down significantly. Frank knew that this knowledge would be his ally in the years to come. When Frank first started learning about nutrition for aging, he was surprised to find that fat wasn't the enemy it was once made out to be. In fact, healthy fats were essential for supporting brain health, reducing inflammation, and maintaining hormone balance. Frank began adding more healthy fats into his diet, including avocados, nuts, seeds, and olive oil. It wasn't about slathering everything in butter or eating unhealthy processed fats. Frank became more conscious of the types of fats he was consuming. He included omega-3 fatty acids, which are particularly beneficial for reducing the risk of heart disease and supporting joint health. He swapped out processed oils for extra virgin olive oil in his cooking and added a handful of almonds to his daily snacks. The most significant change Frank noticed was in his joint health. After weeks of incorporating more healthy fats into his diet, his knees, which had once been stiff and sore, started to feel better. The inflammation that had plagued him for years seemed to subside, and he began to move more freely. As Frank learned more about nutrition, he also began exploring the benefits of plant-based foods. While he hadn't committed to a completely plant-based diet, he started to incorporate more vegetables, fruits, and whole grains into his meals. He found that these foods not only supported his body's overall health but also provided essential vitamins and minerals that were sometimes lacking in a traditional Western diet. Frank's plate was no longer dominated by meat and potatoes. Instead, it was filled with a rainbow of vegetables, grains like quinoa and farro, and healthy plant-based proteins like tofu and chickpeas. He noticed that his energy levels were more stable throughout the day, and his digestive system functioned more efficiently. One of his favorite new meals was a veggie-packed salad with quinoa, chickpeas, spinach, roasted sweet potatoes, and a tahini dressing. He made it a point to eat at least one plant-based meal each day to ensure he was getting the fiber, antioxidants, and nutrients needed to support long-term health. Though Frank had been diligent about macronutrients, protein, fats, and carbohydrates, he realized that micronutrients were just as essential for his health. These small but mighty nutrients, such as vitamins and minerals, played a critical role in immune function, bone health, and the prevention of chronic diseases. Frank made a conscious effort to include foods rich in vitamin D, calcium, and magnesium, which were essential for maintaining bone density and muscle function. He enjoyed fatty fish like salmon, which provided both vitamin D and omega-3 fatty acids, and he added more leafy greens like kale and spinach to his diet, which were rich in calcium and magnesium. He also began to focus on antioxidant-rich foods like berries, citrus fruits, and dark chocolate. These foods helped to protect his cells from oxidative stress, which could accelerate aging and lead to chronic diseases. Another area where Frank had seen significant improvement was in his hydration habits. In the past, he had never paid much attention to how much water he drank throughout the day. But as he researched more about aging, he discovered that proper hydration was crucial for maintaining skin elasticity, digestive health, and cognitive function. He made it a habit to carry a water bottle with him wherever he went. He drank water-rich foods like cucumbers and melons, and he started adding electrolyte-rich drinks to his routine, especially after workouts or long walks. Frank found that staying hydrated helped him feel more energized and improved his focus throughout the day. Perhaps the most important lesson Frank had learned about nutrition in his 50s was the idea of balance. In the past, he had been all or nothing, either he was eating perfectly or he was indulging in unhealthy foods. But now, he understood that the key to a sustainable, long-term healthy lifestyle was moderation. Frank didn't deny himself the occasional treat. He enjoyed a glass of wine with dinner or a piece of dark chocolate for dessert, but he made sure that his everyday meals consisted of nutrient-dense, whole foods. He understood that life was meant to be enjoyed, and food was an important part of that enjoyment. But he also knew that making smart, informed choices most of the time would keep him feeling strong, healthy, and energetic as he aged. Looking back at his nutrition journey, Frank was proud of the progress he had made. He had transformed his relationship with food from one of restriction to one of nourishment. He no longer saw eating as a means of punishment or deprivation but as a way to fuel his body for the life he wanted to live. As Frank looked ahead, he knew that this focus on nutrition would play a central role in maintaining his vitality as he aged. He had made a commitment to himself to continue learning, adapting, and making choices that would allow him to thrive as he entered the later stages of life. Nutrition, after all, wasn't just about living longer, it was about living better. Frank had always prided himself on his physical strength. It had been the cornerstone of his identity for as long as he could remember. But as he entered his 50s, something became increasingly clear: physical health and mental health were inextricably linked. His body was only as strong as his mind allowed it to be. It wasn't enough to just work out, eat well, and sleep right. If his mind wasn't in the right place, his physical efforts were always going to fall short. The more Frank learned, the more he began to see that mental wellness was not a separate entity from physical fitness, it was fundamental to it. Whether he was lifting weights at the gym, going for a run, or simply walking around the block, the quality of his thoughts, emotions, and stress levels all had a direct impact on his performance and recovery. Frank had spent much of his life pushing through pain, discomfort, and challenges with sheer willpower. But now, he realized that this relentless drive often came at the expense of his mental well-being. The constant pressure to do more, achieve more, and be more had created a cycle of stress that wore him down both physically and mentally. It was time for Frank to approach his well-being from a new angle, one that integrated both the body and the mind. Frank wasn't just imagining this connection between mental and physical health, science had confirmed it. Research had shown that stress and anxiety could have profound effects on the body, including increased risk of cardiovascular diseases, poor immune function, and chronic pain. On the flip side, maintaining positive mental health could improve heart function, boost immune response, and even accelerate muscle recovery after intense workouts. The body's stress response, often referred to as the fight or flight response, can be helpful in short bursts. But when stress becomes chronic, as it so often did in Frank's busy life, the body's systems are overworked. Chronic stress leads to the release of cortisol, a hormone that, when elevated for long periods, can break down muscle tissue, increase fat storage, and impair sleep, among other health issues. Frank had noticed over the years that his muscles felt tense and sore far more often when he was stressed or anxious. His recovery time between workouts had lengthened, and even simple tasks sometimes felt overwhelming. The mental weight of constant worry, deadlines, and expectations was showing up in his body in the form of physical exhaustion. Frank knew that the next step in his journey had to involve managing his stress and improving his mental health. He had heard about mindfulness and meditation for years, but he had always been skeptical. He didn't see how sitting still and focusing on his breath could help him achieve anything more than a few minutes of calm. However, desperate for change, Frank decided to give it a try. At first, Frank found meditation challenging. His mind would race with thoughts of work, family, and fitness goals. But he was determined to make it work. Over time, he began to realize that mindfulness wasn't about stopping his thoughts, but about becoming more aware of them. It was about accepting his thoughts without judgment, letting them pass through his mind like clouds, without holding on to them. Frank started to incorporate short meditation sessions into his routine, often right after his morning workout. He would sit in a quiet spot, close his eyes, and focus on his breath. Gradually, the practice began to make a noticeable difference. He found that his mind became clearer, and his body felt less tense. He was able to approach his workouts with more focus and energy, and his stress levels began to decrease. Meditation was no longer a novelty, it became an essential part of his routine. His increased ability to stay present allowed him to stay calm in the face of challenges and to recover more effectively after workouts. Frank realized that the more he trained his mind, the better his body responded. Another area where Frank worked to improve his mental health was in cultivating positive thinking. For years, Frank had been a perfectionist, constantly striving for better results, better performance, and better outcomes. This relentless pursuit of excellence had often led to frustration, burnout, and a sense of inadequacy when things didn't go as planned. Now, Frank understood that a positive mindset wasn't about ignoring difficulties or challenges. Instead, it was about reframing his thinking. Instead of focusing on what went wrong, he focused on what went right. When a workout didn't go as planned or he faced a setback, Frank started to ask himself, "What can I learn from this?" He began to see each failure as a learning opportunity and each challenge as a chance to grow. This shift in mindset helped him maintain motivation and find joy in the process of living a healthy life, rather than fixating on the end goal. Frank also recognized that mental health wasn't just about managing his internal thoughts, it was also about his relationships and social connections. Loneliness, isolation, and a lack of meaningful social interaction had been linked to increased levels of stress and poorer physical health. Frank had always been someone who valued his alone time, but he also knew that connection was important for his mental well-being. He started making an effort to reconnect with friends and family. Instead of spending every evening in front of the TV or in his home office, Frank scheduled regular social activities, whether it was meeting a friend for a walk, having dinner with his children, or simply catching up with a colleague. These interactions, however small, helped boost his mood and gave him a sense of belonging. Frank was surprised to learn that the simple act of sharing a meal or chatting with someone could improve his mood and, by extension, his physical health. Positive social interactions reduced his levels of cortisol, helped him feel more supported, and encouraged him to keep prioritizing his health. As Frank continued his journey toward better mental health, he also began to focus on improving his sleep. For years, he had considered sleep to be a secondary priority, something to be sacrificed in favor of more productive hours in the day. But he had learned that adequate sleep was essential for both mental and physical recovery. Frank worked to develop a sleep routine that allowed him to get 7 to 8 hours of quality rest each night. He limited his screen time before bed, avoided caffeine late in the day, and created a peaceful bedtime ritual to help calm his mind. As a result, his energy levels soared, his focus improved, and his body responded better to workouts. His mental clarity and mood also improved. Frank learned that a good night's sleep wasn't just about resting the body, it was also about giving the brain the chance to recharge, process emotions, and prepare for the day ahead. By now, Frank had fully embraced the idea that his physical health and mental health were two sides of the same coin. The more he nurtured his mental health through mindfulness, positive thinking, social connection, and rest, the better his body responded. And conversely, the more he took care of his physical health through nutrition, exercise, and recovery, the clearer and more focused his mind became. Frank had learned that the mind-body connection was not a theory but a powerful reality. To live a full, healthy life, both his body and mind needed to work in harmony. And this interconnectedness was something that he would carry with him for the rest of his journey into aging. Every fitness journey, no matter how well planned or executed, encounters setbacks. Frank had learned this the hard way. Over the years, there were times when his motivation waned, injuries slowed his progress, and life's pressures seemed to push him into a state of stagnation. But one thing was for sure, setbacks didn't have to be permanent. They were simply part of the process, not the end of it. Frank had learned how to face those challenges head-on and come out stronger on the other side. The first major setback Frank faced in his 50s was an injury, a torn ligament in his knee from an intense sprinting session. Frank had always pushed himself hard, and this time, he'd gone a bit too far. The injury forced him to take several weeks off from running, one of his favorite activities. He felt frustrated, angry, and, at times, defeated. For someone who had always found strength in his physical ability, being forced to slow down felt like a loss of identity. At first, Frank struggled to stay motivated. His usual routine was disrupted, and he feared that the months of hard work he'd put into building strength would be lost. He knew that his fitness would likely suffer, but what hurt the most was that he had to give up something he loved so much. Running had always been his escape, his time to clear his mind and challenge his body. It wasn't easy, but Frank eventually realized that he had a choice. He could let this injury define him and spiral into frustration, or he could adapt and find new ways to stay fit while recovering. After a few weeks of wallowing in his frustration, Frank began to understand the importance of reframing setbacks. Instead of seeing his knee injury as a roadblock, he decided to view it as an opportunity to focus on other areas of his fitness, areas he had been neglecting while always focusing on running and strength training. He turned to upper body strength exercises. He knew that his upper body could still be worked even if his legs were out of commission. Frank began doing more core exercises, such as planks and sit-ups, as well as upper body workouts like push-ups and rows. He also focused on flexibility and mobility, which he realized were crucial to preventing future injuries. He set new goals that didn't rely on running. The injury gave him a chance to build a more balanced, full-body fitness routine. And while it was frustrating at first, Frank quickly found that being adaptable was key to maintaining his motivation during difficult times. Through his injury recovery, Frank also learned an important lesson about patience and self-compassion. For someone who was used to pushing through discomfort and striving for more, learning to accept his limitations was hard. But Frank came to understand that recovery, whether from an injury, a mental setback, or a temporary loss of motivation, required time. Instead of beating himself up for not being able to perform at his usual level, Frank practiced being kind to himself. He recognized that his body needed time to heal, and in the meantime, he could focus on the things he could control. He didn't need to be perfect, he just needed to keep moving forward, even if the steps were small. Self-compassion also meant acknowledging his frustrations without letting them define his progress. It meant taking a deep breath and reminding himself that setbacks didn't take away from his overall journey, they were just part of it. As Frank worked through his recovery, he also took steps to find new sources of motivation. For a while, his progress had been fueled by external goals, his desire to get stronger, run faster, or hit certain fitness milestones. But now, he focused more on the internal rewards of physical activity, such as the mental clarity it gave him or the sense of accomplishment he felt after completing a workout. He began to tap into a different kind of motivation, one that came from the enjoyment of the process rather than the end result. The workout wasn't just about getting to the finish line, it was about showing up for himself every day, regardless of the circumstances. Frank also sought inspiration from others who had faced similar challenges. He read about athletes who had overcome injuries or difficult setbacks and came back even stronger. Their stories reminded him that resilience was about persistence, not perfection. It was about pushing through tough moments, learning from them, and growing stronger in the process. One of the most important things Frank did during this time was focus on small wins. When the big goals felt out of reach, he set smaller, more manageable targets that he could achieve daily. Whether it was completing a 20-minute strength training session or walking a few extra steps each day, Frank celebrated these small victories. He knew that consistency was more important than intensity when facing a setback. Frank also began to look at his recovery process as a chance to build better habits. He realized that the way he approached setbacks in the future would depend on the habits he formed now. He made it a priority to show up for his workouts every day, even if they were shorter or less intense than usual. This consistency helped him maintain a sense of normalcy and reminded him that he could still make progress, even on days when he felt less than motivated. As Frank continued on his journey, he leaned more heavily on his support system. In the past, he had been a bit of a lone wolf, believing that his success was something he needed to achieve on his own. But as he faced setbacks, he began to see the value of having people around him, whether it was a coach, friends, family, or a workout buddy. Frank reached out to his workout community, a group of friends who shared his passion for fitness. They provided encouragement and shared their own experiences with setbacks, reminding him that it was normal to face obstacles. Their support helped him stay grounded and motivated, especially during those days when self-doubt crept in. Eventually, Frank's knee healed. But the lessons he learned during that time stayed with him. He now approached setbacks with a different mindset. Instead of viewing them as failures, he saw them as opportunities for growth. He had learned that resilience wasn't about bouncing back immediately, it was about finding the strength to continue moving forward, even when the path was unclear. In the end, Frank's setback had been a blessing in disguise. It had forced him to slow down, reevaluate his goals, and embrace new forms of fitness. Most importantly, it had taught him that the journey to health wasn't a straight line. It was filled with twists and turns, but each one was a chance to learn, adapt, and emerge stronger. As Frank stood in front of the mirror, he couldn't help but notice the changes. His once lustrous hair had started to thin, and a few more lines had appeared around his eyes. He was no longer the man he had been in his 30s and 40s, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if his best years were behind him. But then he reminded himself of something important: aging wasn't something to fear or resist. It was simply another chapter in his journey, a chapter he could approach with purpose, strength, and grace. Aging often comes with a sense of loss of youthful vigor, loss of the body we once had, or even loss of the lifestyle we enjoyed. But Frank had come to realize that aging wasn't about losing what he had, it was about gaining new strengths, perspectives, and opportunities. Rather than shrinking away from the inevitable, Frank had made the choice to embrace it. In Frank's earlier years, he had equated aging with decline. It was something to be feared, something that meant limitations, slowing down, and eventually being put out to pasture. Society often depicted aging as something negative, a stage in life where one's abilities diminished and where the joys of youth and vitality were left behind. But Frank had learned that this perspective was misguided. Aging wasn't a curse, it was an opportunity. An opportunity to redefine strength, health, and vitality in ways that were more aligned with the current phase of his life. Over the past few years, Frank had started to look at his health from a holistic perspective. He had learned to approach his fitness with a focus not on just performance, but on longevity and well-being. He now saw his body as a work in progress, not something to be discarded once it reached a certain age. And just as his physical health needed attention, so did his mental health. It was just as essential in navigating this stage of life. Frank realized that aging wasn't about fighting the passage of time. It was about embracing it with purpose, using his experiences, wisdom, and mindset to build a life that felt just as meaningful, if not more so, than when he was younger. One of the most important lessons Frank had learned about aging was the importance of having purpose. In his younger years, Frank had been driven by the pursuit of success and achievement. Whether it was conquering a new fitness goal, advancing in his career, or completing a big project, his motivation had always been externally driven. But as he got older, Frank began to realize that true fulfillment didn't come from external achievements alone, it came from inner purpose. What gave him meaning now wasn't just the next race or workout, but the impact he had on others and the way he contributed to his community. He started focusing on mentoring younger individuals, whether it was sharing fitness advice or guiding colleagues at work. He took pride in being a source of wisdom and inspiration, not only for his peers but for the younger generation who might look to him for guidance. Frank had learned that giving back was a form of strength, and it gave him a deep sense of purpose that no trophy or medal could provide. In addition to his mentoring, Frank started to volunteer in local community projects, spending time helping others who were facing challenges similar to his own. Whether it was helping seniors with fitness or offering advice to those recovering from setbacks, Frank found that these moments of service brought him a sense of fulfillment that transcended personal goals. In Frank's earlier years, strength had always been defined by how much weight he could lift or how fast he could run. But now, as he embraced aging, he realized that true strength wasn't about measuring his physical capabilities against some arbitrary standard. It was about resilience, adaptability, and the ability to continue pushing forward with vitality, no matter the age. Frank found that his approach to fitness began to shift. Instead of trying to outperform his younger self, he focused on maintaining functional strength, the kind of strength that would support him in his daily life, keep him independent, and help him feel capable as he aged. He still incorporated strength training into his routine, but his focus had moved from hitting new personal records to maintaining balance, flexibility, and mobility. He also noticed that recovery had become more important than performance. As he got older, his body didn't bounce back from hard workouts the way it used to. He learned that the key to staying strong in his 50s and beyond was giving his body the time it needed to rest and recover. Rather than pushing through fatigue, he focused on recovery strategies like stretching, mobility exercises, and using mindful movement to avoid injury and improve joint health. As Frank grew older, his body naturally changed. His metabolism slowed, his joints ached a bit more, and he found that it took longer to lose the weight he had once shed effortlessly. But rather than seeing these changes as problems, Frank approached them with a mindset of adaptation. He learned to adjust his diet to better align with his body's needs. He ate more nutrient-dense, whole foods to support his aging body and gave up on quick fixes like fad diets. Instead of focusing on losing weight quickly, he focused on nourishing his body and keeping his energy levels stable throughout the day. In terms of workouts, Frank began to incorporate more low-impact exercises like swimming, yoga, and walking. These activities gave him the cardiovascular benefits he needed without putting as much strain on his joints. He also added more recovery days to his schedule, understanding that his body needed more time to recuperate than it had in the past. Adapting to these changes didn't mean giving up on fitness, it meant being smarter about how he approached it. Frank realized that there were many gains that came with aging, gains that he had never fully appreciated when he was younger. With age came wisdom, patience, and a greater appreciation for the simple joys of life. He learned to value the moments that younger Frank would have rushed through without a second thought, the quiet mornings, the laughter with friends, the deep conversations with loved ones. Aging also brought a deeper sense of gratitude for his health and his body. While he might not be able to run as fast as he once did or lift as much weight as he used to, he was still able to move, to walk, to breathe with ease. That, in itself, was a victory. Frank embraced aging not as something to fear, but as something to celebrate. His 50s were a time of reflection and redefinition, a time to look back at all he had achieved and all that was still to come. The journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. Frank sat on the edge of the porch, sipping his coffee as the sun rose over the horizon. The crisp morning air carried with it a sense of calm, and for the first time in a long while, he truly felt at peace with himself. At 51, with his body, mind, and spirit stronger than ever, Frank had come to the realization that the pursuit of health and fitness was not just about the physical, it was about embracing life with passion, purpose and vitality at every stage of the journey. The past few years had been a whirlwind of challenges, triumphs, setbacks, and growth. Frank had faced the harsh realities of aging, struggled with injuries, and had to reevaluate his approach to fitness. But through it all, he had learned the most important lesson of all: living with intention, vitality, and purpose is the key to thriving at any age. In his younger years, Frank had been driven by external goals, performance, success, competition. The world told him that he should always be striving for more, always pushing for greater achievements. But over time, and particularly as he entered his 50s, Frank had come to realize that true purpose wasn't defined by the trophies on the shelf or the titles on a resume. It was defined by the impact he made on others, the growth he experienced within, and the life he lived. Purpose, Frank learned, wasn't something you stumbled upon by accident, it was something you created. It was about finding meaning in the everyday moments, in the relationships you nurtured, in the challenges you overcame. It was about waking up each day with a sense of direction, whether that meant making a difference in someone's life, pursuing a passion, or simply finding joy in the small, seemingly insignificant moments. Frank had always been passionate about fitness, but now, his passion extended far beyond the gym. It was about helping others find their own strength and purpose. It was about teaching younger generations that aging didn't mean slowing down, it meant shifting focus, rethinking goals, and embracing life with a newfound appreciation for what truly mattered. While fitness remained an integral part of Frank's life, his passion was no longer solely tied to lifting heavier weights or running faster times. Frank's passion was now about living fully, in every sense of the word. It was about cultivating his mental health, investing in meaningful relationships, and sharing his knowledge and experiences with others. Frank began to volunteer more, not just for his own fulfillment but for the joy of giving back. Whether it was coaching a local youth soccer team, helping seniors at a community center, or mentoring young entrepreneurs, Frank found that his impact on the world was far more significant when it was rooted in love, service, and community. He realized that he didn't need to achieve extraordinary feats in the eyes of the world to feel fulfilled, he just needed to show up, give his best, and serve those around him. Passion, he now understood, wasn't just about doing something you loved, it was about being present in the lives of others and finding fulfillment through connection, growth, and shared experiences. Vitality was the third key element in Frank's newfound perspective. It wasn't about having boundless energy or being in perfect shape, it was about living each day with a sense of purpose and joy, no matter what challenges came his way. As Frank matured, he recognized that vitality was much deeper than physical fitness. It was about mental and emotional resilience, the ability to adapt, and the determination to keep going, no matter the obstacles. Frank learned to find vitality in his everyday routines. It was about waking up early and enjoying the peace of the morning, taking a walk in nature, practicing mindfulness, or simply spending time with family and friends. Vitality was also about cultivating a positive mindset and practicing gratitude, recognizing the blessings in his life and focusing on the things that brought him joy, not the things that brought him stress. As Frank's body aged, he began to prioritize things that nourished his spirit. He found vitality not in the intensity of his workouts, but in the richness of his life experiences. He made time for hobbies, for relaxation, and for the people he loved. Vitality, he learned, was about cultivating a life that felt full and purposeful, regardless of the number on a calendar. One of the greatest lessons Frank had learned on his journey was how to embrace change with grace. Aging wasn't something to fear or fight, it was something to accept and even celebrate. His body had changed, but his mindset had evolved, too. Frank now understood that his strength wasn't just in his muscles, but in his ability to adapt, learn, and grow through each stage of life. The wisdom he had gained over the years allowed him to approach aging with a sense of calm confidence. He was no longer focused on trying to maintain the physical appearance or strength he had in his 30s or 40s. Instead, he focused on being the best version of himself in his 50s and beyond. He had learned that true beauty came from within, from the way he treated himself and others, and from the way he lived his life with purpose and passion. Frank embraced the changes in his body with curiosity rather than fear. He knew that each new stage of life brought its own challenges, but he also knew that it brought new opportunities for growth and self-discovery. Aging was not an obstacle, it was a new chapter in his story. As Frank reflected on the years behind him and the years still ahead, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His journey had been filled with ups and downs, but through it all, he had found the courage to continue evolving. He had built a legacy, not just through his achievements, but through the relationships he had nurtured, the lessons he had shared, and the positive impact he had made on those around him. Frank realized that his legacy wasn't about being remembered for his physical accomplishments or his external success. His legacy was about the people whose lives he had touched and the wisdom he had imparted. It was about the way he had lived each day with authenticity, kindness, and purpose. And as he looked forward to the future, Frank felt ready for whatever challenges came his way, knowing that he had the strength, the passion, and the vitality to keep moving forward. Frank had learned the ultimate lesson: the key to living well, to thriving at any age, was about embracing the process, not just the destination. It was about living with intention, nurturing your body, mind, and spirit, and always moving forward with purpose, passion, and vitality. The pursuit of health and fitness was no longer about perfecting his body or achieving external milestones. It was about embracing life fully, in all its forms. It was about showing up for himself, for others, and for the future. Aging wasn't something to fear, it was something to celebrate. In the end, Frank understood that the journey was never truly about being the strongest, the fastest, or the most accomplished. It was about living with love, purpose, and vitality, no matter where life took him. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?